The photograph sat in a drawer at the Smithsonian for 97 years before anyone asked why it was never displayed. When I finally obtained a copy through a Freedom of Information request, I understood the silence. The image shows what appears to be an archaeological excavation from 1912, somewhere in the American Midwest. Standard procedure for the era, careful documentation, formal poses, except for one detail that makes the photograph impossible to explain. The skeleton they're standing next to measures over 9 feet long. Not an exaggeration, not a trick of perspective. 9 feet. And it's not alone. Between 1880 and 1920, newspapers across America reported discoveries of giant human skeletons with disturbing frequency, not isolated incidents, not hoaxes perpetrated by carnival showmen, but documented excavations conducted by respected institutions. The New York Times covered several. Regional papers reported dozens more. Archaeological societies filed official reports. And then, sometime around 1930, the discoveries stopped being reported. Not because they stopped happening, but because someone decided they should stop being discussed. I've spent 2 years tracking these reports, cross-referencing newspaper archives with archaeological records, matching dates and locations, following the paper trail of where these bones were supposedly sent. What I found wasn't a simple cover-up. It was something far stranger, a pattern that connects these discoveries directly to territories once mapped as Tartaria. The first cluster of giant skeleton discoveries occurred in the Ohio River Valley, concentrated in mound excavations between 1883 and 1894. Local historical societies documented the finds meticulously. Heights ranging from 7.5 feet to over 10 feet. Skulls significantly larger than modern human proportions. Bone density that suggested these weren't cases of gigantism as we understand it medically, but something else entirely. The reports describe anatomical features that don't match known human populations. Double rows of teeth appeared in multiple specimens. Cranial structures that suggested different proportions. And here's what nobody talks about. These skeletons were found wearing artifacts, not buried with artifacts, wearing them. Copper bracelets still encircling arm bones. Breastplates that would have been impossibly large for normal human frames. And in 3 separate excavations, inscribed tablets that bore writing no one could decipher. The tablets were photographed, documented in archaeological reports, then sent to the Smithsonian for analysis. They never appeared in any published research. When researchers inquired about them decades later, the official response was that no such artifacts existed in the collection, but the photographs exist. I have copies, and the writing on those tablets matches symbols found in exactly one other place. Artifacts recovered from sites in Central Asia, from the regions historically associated with Tartarian territories. Not similar symbols, identical character forms. Which raises a question that archaeology refuses to address. How did giant human remains in Ohio end up buried with inscriptions matching those from cultures supposedly existing thousands of miles away on a completely different continent? The pattern extends beyond Ohio. Wisconsin mound excavations in the 1890s uncovered similar remains. Minnesota, Illinois, Tennessee all reported findings of oversized human skeletons during this same period, and every single time, the remains were sent to major institutions for study. The Smithsonian received the majority. Some went to Harvard's Peabody Museum. A few ended up at regional universities. And then they vanished from catalogues, from published research, from accessible collections. When modern researchers request access, they're told the specimens were lost, damaged, or never existed despite newspaper documentation proving otherwise. An 1894 article from the Minneapolis Journal describes an excavation in detail. The skeleton measured 8 feet, 6 inches. The accompanying photograph shows 5 men standing around the remains for scale. The article names the lead archaeologist, describes the exact location, even includes measurements of the burial mound. I tracked down that archaeologist's personal papers donated to a university archive after his death. His field notes describe the discovery, include sketches of the skeleton's unusual features, and document that the remains were shipped to the Smithsonian in October 1894. The Smithsonian has no record of receiving them. This wasn't sloppy record-keeping. Major institutions don't lose 9-foot skeletons. They don't misplace artifacts that could rewrite human history. They don't accidentally destroy specimens that were carefully excavated, documented, photographed, and shipped with explicit instructions for preservation. What happened was deliberate removal, not of the physical remains alone, but of the very possibility that they existed. And here's where it connects to something larger. The timing matters. These discoveries peaked between 1880 and 1920, the exact same period when maps of Tartaria were being systematically removed from circulation, when historical references to Tartarian civilization were being edited out of encyclopedias, when the official narrative of human history was being standardized into the version we're taught today. The giant skeletons weren't just evidence of unusual human remains. They were evidence of something that connected the American continent to that erased civilization. Evidence that suggested Tartarian influence, or presence, or origin extended far beyond what the revised maps were willing to show. The newspapers kept reporting for a while, but you can watch the language change. Early articles described the discoveries as significant archaeological findings. By 1910, the tone shifts. Reports become shorter, less detailed, more skeptical. By 1925, newspapers stop covering new discoveries entirely, but the excavations continued. Farmers kept finding them when ploughing fields. Construction crews unearthed them when digging foundations. Amateur archaeologists documented them in private journals that never made it to publication. The discoveries didn't stop. The reporting stopped. I found a collection of letters exchanged between regional museum curators in the 1930s. They're discussing specimens in coded language, referring to them only as sensitive materials or problematic artifacts. One letter, dated 1936, is particularly revealing. The curator writes that he's been instructed to transfer certain items to federal custody, that the specimens in question are being consolidated at a central location for national security purposes. National security. Giant human skeletons were classified as matters of national security. What exactly were they protecting? Not just the existence of unusually tall humans. That alone wouldn't justify this level of systematic erasure. They were protecting something these remains proved. Something about human origins, about historical timelines, about connections between civilizations that weren't supposed to exist. The burial contexts tell the story the bones themselves couldn't. These weren't random graves. The mounds where these remains were found showed evidence of sophisticated construction, astronomical alignments, geometric precision in their layout. And they contained artifacts that don't fit the narrative we're given about pre-Columbian America. Metalwork of a quality that indigenous peoples supposedly hadn't developed. Textiles using techniques that weren't documented in the Americas. And those inscriptions appearing again and again, connecting these sites to something far older and far more widespread. One photograph survived in a private collection, never donated to any institution. It shows a burial chamber from a Kentucky mound, excavated in 1897. The walls are lined with stone blocks fitted together with precision. No mortar, just perfectly cut stones that interlock. The same construction technique appears in structures attributed to ancient civilizations across the world. The same technique that appears in photographs of ruined buildings in Central Asia, in regions that maps once labelled as Tartarian territory. Standing in that chamber, barely visible in the photograph's background, is a skeleton. The proportions are wrong. The skull is too large, the femur too long. And arranged around the remains are copper artifacts, with geometric patterns, patterns that match designs found thousands of miles away in mounds along the Mississippi, in burial sites in Minnesota, in excavations from territories that official history insists had no contact with each other. How did identical burial practices, identical artifact designs, identical construction techniques appear across thousands of miles of supposedly disconnected indigenous peoples? The standard explanation crumbles under scrutiny. We're told these similarities are coincidence, that humans independently arrived at the same solutions. But the mathematics don't support it. The precision is too exact, the timing too synchronized, the symbolic language too consistent, unless these weren't disconnected peoples at all. Unless something unified them, something that extended across the continent before recorded history, something that left these massive remains as evidence of its existence. The Smithsonian's official position hasn't changed in a century. They claim no giant skeletons were ever in their collection. They maintain that newspaper reports were exaggerations, that measurements were errors, that the entire phenomenon was a combination of hoaxes and misidentification of normal human remains. But their own historical correspondence tells a different story. I found requisition forms in the National Archives. Official Smithsonian paperwork from the 1890s requesting funding for storage facilities to house skeletal specimens of unusual size and significance. The forms specify dimensions, describe preservation requirements, even calculate the cost of specialized display cases. These aren't documents describing normal archaeological specimens. These are preparations for something extraordinary. The funding was approved, the facilities were built, and then every reference to what they contained was systematically removed from institutional records. The storage rooms still exist in the Smithsonian's off-site facilities. I've seen the floor plans, but those rooms are now listed as containing routine ethnographic materials. The original designation, the one that appeared on architectural drawings from 1896, has been crossed out and relabeled. Someone went through decades of documentation and methodically erased what those rooms were built to contain. Not recently, this happened long ago, probably in the 1930s or 40s, based on the paperwork style. A coordinated effort to rewrite institutional memory, to make certain specimens disappear, not just physically, but from the very records that proved they existed. And it worked. For generations, anyone questioning the giant skeleton reports was dismissed as a conspiracy theorist, told they were believing tabloid exaggerations, accused of promoting pseudoscience. The institutional denial was so complete, so confident, that it became impossible to challenge without being ridiculed. But the evidence keeps surfacing, not just photographs and newspaper clippings, but physical proof that's harder to erase. Mounds that were never fully excavated, private collections that were never donated, field notes from archaeologists who kept personal copies, and most importantly, new discoveries that keep happening despite the official silence, because the remains are still there, still buried across the American landscape, waiting to be found by people who don't yet know they're supposed to pretend these things don't exist. The question isn't whether giant human remains were found throughout North America. The documentation proves they were. The question is why their existence required such comprehensive erasure. What happens when the physical evidence becomes undeniable? When construction crews stumble across remains that don't fit any approved narrative? I tracked down incident reports from highway expansion projects, municipal construction, private development across the American Midwest. The pattern is remarkably consistent. Crews discover skeletal remains of unusual size. Work stops temporarily. Officials arrive. Then the site is quickly cleared, the remains removed, and work resumes within hours. No archaeological survey, no public documentation, no explanation for what was found or where it went. A road construction project outside Columbus, Ohio in 1978. Workers broke through into what appeared to be a burial chamber, The foreman's report, filed with the county, describes skeletal remains exceeding 8 feet in length. Photographs were taken. The State Archaeological Office was notified. And then the file goes silent. No follow-up investigation. No published findings. The photographs vanished from county records sometime before 1985. All that remains is the foreman's initial incident report, a single page describing something that, according to official science, cannot exist. This scenario repeated across dozens of construction sites. A shopping mall in Illinois, a housing development in Indiana, a pipeline project in Wisconsin. Each time, the same sequence: discovery, documentation, official involvement, and then immediate silence. The remains disappear into the same institutional void that swallowed the Smithsonian specimens. But here's what changed: digital documentation. By the 1990s, workers had cameras. By the 2000s, they had phones, and some of them took pictures before officials arrived. These images circulate in strange corners of the internet, dismissed as hoaxes, attacked as manipulated, yet never definitively debunked. Because how do you prove a photograph is fake when it shows exactly what hundreds of newspaper reports from a century earlier described? I've examined dozens of these images. The forensic details are consistent. Bone structure that matches human anatomy, but scaled proportionally larger. Burial contexts that align with known indigenous practices. Artifact associations that place them in the same cultural traditions as the mound builders. These aren't crude fabrications. They're documentation of finds that shouldn't exist according to current scientific consensus. The resistance to examination is revealing. When presented with this evidence, mainstream archaeology doesn't engage with the material. They don't analyze the photographs, don't investigate the construction sites, don't even acknowledge the documentation exists. The response is pure dismissal. If it contradicts established narrative, it must be false. The evidence is rejected before examination, which isn't science, it's ideology. Consider what acceptance would require. If giant skeletal remains are real, if they're as widespread as the documentation suggests, then the entire framework of North American prehistory needs revision. The timeline of human habitation, the origins of indigenous peoples, the nature of the civilization that built those massive mounds. Everything currently taught as established fact becomes questionable. That's why the evidence had to be erased. Not because it was false, but because it was inconvenient. Because it pointed toward a version of history that didn't align with the narrative constructed in the late 1800s. The narrative that made westward expansion seem like bringing civilization to an empty wilderness, rather than displacing the remnants of something far older. The giant remains suggest continuity. They connect the mound builders to the indigenous peoples encountered by European settlers. They imply that the massive earthworks weren't ancient mysteries, but relatively recent constructions by ancestors still remembered in oral traditions. They validate indigenous claims about their own history, claims that were systematically dismissed as mythology. And perhaps, most significantly, they connect North American civilizations to something larger. Because if you accept that giant human remains existed here, you have to ask where else they existed. The answer appears in archaeological records worldwide, in reports from every continent, in discoveries that face the same pattern of institutional denial and evidence suppression. This brings us back to the territories we discussed at the beginning, the vast expanse labeled Tartaria on old maps, the civilization that left massive architectural remains across Eurasia, the culture that official history insists never existed as a unified entity. What if the giant remains found across North America weren't isolated anomalies, but evidence of the same widespread presence? The burial practices match. The construction techniques align. The timeline corresponds. The systematic erasure follows identical patterns. Different continents, different institutions, same coordinated silence about the same type of evidence. I'm not proposing certainty. I'm pointing at fragments of a pattern that keeps emerging despite generations of suppression. skeletal remains that document something outside our accepted framework. Institutional responses that prioritize narrative control over scientific investigation, and a historical record that shows this erasure wasn't accidental but deliberate, coordinated, sustained across decades and continents. The remains are still there, buried in mounds that were never excavated, locked in storage facilities under false classifications, documented in photographs that circulate without context, waiting in the ground beneath highways and shopping centers, beneath the infrastructure of a civilization built on top of evidence it refuses to acknowledge. What were they hiding? Not just the bones themselves, but what those bones represented. A version of human history that doesn't fit the timeline we've been taught. A connection between peoples and places that official narratives insist remain separate. And perhaps most disturbing, evidence that the erasure of inconvenient truth is not a modern phenomenon, but a practice refined over centuries, applied systematically whenever reality threatens to contradict approved stories about who we are and where we came from. The photographs exist. The newspaper reports fill archives across the country. The institutional paperwork documents what was received and then deliberately mislabeled. You can dismiss individual pieces as errors or hoaxes, but you cannot dismiss the pattern. Not when it spans decades, crosses institutional boundaries, and repeats with mechanical precision across an entire continent. I keep returning to that photograph from 1912, the one that sat in a drawer for 97 years. The men standing beside that 9-foot skeleton knew what they were documenting. They understood the significance. They sent it to institutions specifically because they believed it mattered, because they thought it would contribute to our understanding of human history. They were wrong about that last part, not because the evidence didn't matter, but because someone decided it mattered too much, that our understanding of history needed protecting more than it needed truth, that certain discoveries were too disruptive to acknowledge, too problematic to integrate into the narrative we'd already committed to teaching. The bones are still there, in storage rooms relabeled to hide their contents, in mounds waiting for the next construction crew, in private collections passed down through families who knew better than to donate them to institutions that would make them disappear. The evidence didn't go away. It just went silent. But silence isn't the same as absence. And institutional denial isn't the same as proof of falsehood. Sometimes what they refuse to discuss is exactly what demands the closest examination.